All right, so we're going to read chapter 5, the beginning of page. Let me find the page. Okay, page 82. Chapter 5, D-Day. When I opened my eyes the morning of September 23rd, the first thing I noticed was the sun. It streamed into my bedroom through a pair of bare, horizontal windows near the ceiling. After such a wet and gloomy weekend, this was surely a good sign. The National Guard troops were gone, and the court orders still stood. Once again, I put on my new store-bought dress. The plan was to meet at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Bates and wait for instructions from the city police, which now had the responsibility of protecting us. When Mother and I arrived by 7:45 a.m., several of the other students and their parents were already there. The front yard and living room were abuzz with media, snapping photographs, shooting television footage, conducting interviews, and darting here and there. As usual, I skirted past them with little notice and joined the cluster of students. Soon our long wait would be over. By 8 a.m., all 9 of us were there. We chatted anxiously about our first day of school, which classes we had, which ones we feared, what our teachers might be like. I think all of us recognized what could happen. We'd seen the mob outside the school. Elizabeth had even been close enough to feel its wrath, but I didn't want to talk, or even think, about the danger. None of us did. The police called a little while later and instructed Mrs. Bates to transport us to a side entrance of the school, away from the crowd gathering out front. It was time for us to go, Mrs. Bates said. We hugged our parents and headed out. I was excited to be finally starting school. Each day out had been worrisome for me. Despite trying to keep up with the homework, I couldn't help wondering what I was missing by not being in class, and I worried about falling behind. I would work extra hard and do whatever it took to make up for the lost time, I promised myself. Before heading out the door, I glanced back at Mother and she had that look on her face again, the smile that didn't match the worry in her eyes. The 9 of us then piled into 2 cars, driven by NAACP officials, for the short ride to Central. As we drew closer to the side of the school, I could hear the muffled sounds of a crowd beyond the car's closed windows. Though the school building mostly blocked my full view of the crowd gathered out front, I knew the mob was back. They were not going to give up their fight easily, but neither was I. The cars carrying us rolled up to the curb, one behind the other, and pulled quickly to a stop next to the side entrance. The drivers hopped out and yanked open the car doors. Suddenly, the chants and jeers of the crowd sounded deafening. 2, 4, 6, 8, we ain't gonna integrate. I stepped out of the car and moved swiftly behind the other students. I had no time to think or worry about what the crowd was saying or doing. Just take one step and then another, I told myself. In no time, all 9 of us were at the side door. We rushed through a set of large double doors, which closed quickly behind us and shut out the light. No one made a sound, but we kept moving rapidly through the darkness. I just followed the footsteps up some stairs and then up another set into the light. Next, there was a long hallway, and we stopped just outside the main office, where we were met by a primly dressed white woman with graying hair and glasses. She seemed very professional and pleasant enough as she handed us our schedules and pointed the way to our classes. I would come to know her as Elizabeth Huckabee, my English teacher and the vice principal for girls. As my 8 comrades and I were preparing to head to our classes for the first time, the crowd outside was growing steadily and working itself into a frenzy. The chaos had started even before we arrived. News photographers and reporters captured the upheaval that unfurled when 4 black journalists who had been with us at the Bates' home made it to the scene just moments ahead of us. Alex Wilson, editor of the Memphis-based Tri-State Defender, and Moses Newson, on assignment for the Baltimore Afro-American, led the way, inching toward the rowdy crowd to cover the scene. They were followed by James L. Hicks, editor of the Amsterdam News in New York, and Earl Davey, a freelance photographer who often took photos for the newspaper owned by Mr. and Mrs. Bates. 2 white men began following them. "Go home, you son of a B.N., one of them yelled. A few more white men leapt in front of the journalists with outstretched hands to block their path. "We are newspapermen," Wilson retorted. "We only want to do our jobs," Hicks added. but the taunting only continued. The crowd quickly swelled, and mayhem broke out. Someone threatened a lynching. Others lunged into the black journalist, kicking, punching, and spitting at them. The attackers slammed Davy Graflick's camera to the concrete sidewalk and chased him, while another group attacked Newson and Hicks until they were finally able to escape. But Wilson, a veteran journalist and former war correspondent, stood his ground. He had seen this kind of hatred up close as he traveled throughout the South covering civil rights, including the Emmett Till trial in the fall of 1955. As Wilson picked up his wide-brimmed hat and straightened himself, one of the ringleaders ordered him to run. But Wilson, a lanky ex-Marine who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, refused. Incensed by this man's proud composure, the mob grew more virulent in their attack. Finally, one of them delivered a crushing blow to the back of Wilson's head with a heavy object believed to have been a brick. The tall black man tumbled to the ground. In his own account of the incident, Wilson later wrote that a vision of Elizabeth Eckford, as she with dignity strode through a jeering, hooting gauntlet of segregationists, had flashed in his mind and given him the courage to face the mob on his feet. But Wilson never fully recovered from the beating. He developed a nervous condition widely reported as Parkinson's disease and died 3 years later at age 51. I was horrified when I saw the attack on the evening news. As leery as I was of the press, I felt a kind of kinship with the black reporters who were risking their own lives to tell our collective story. They were accomplished professionals, but in the wooded hamlets and Klan territory throughout Mississippi, Alabama, and on this day Little Rock, they were as reviled as the subjects they traveled miles to cover. But they kept coming and kept writing, long before the mainstream press jumped on board. Mother read her black newspapers and magazines with a kind of religious devotion. That's how she kept up with what was going on with our people, she said. When I read the news accounts of the attack on Mr. Wilson and his colleagues over the following days, I realized that the 4 of them had unwittingly become decoys for the 9 of us. There was much speculation then about whether there was some kind of agreement for those 4 men to distract the crowd while the 9 of us entered the building, but Wilson and his colleagues all denied it. I was never told of any such deal either. Of course, as a 14-year-old, I likely wouldn't have been privy to such information anyhow, but I've never believed that those 4 journalists were doing anything in that moment other than their jobs. Eventually, that morning, someone in the crowd recognized that while the journalists were being savagely beaten, the 9 of us were entering the school building. The hysteria immediately shifted our way. By then, though, the doors already had shut behind us. Benjamin Fine, the New York Times reporter who had catapulted our story to the front page of his newspaper weeks earlier, gave this account. "They've gone in," a man shouted. "Oh, God," said a woman, "the blank are in school." A group of 6 girls dressed in skirts and sweaters, hair in ponytails, started to shriek and wail. "The blank are in our school," they howled hysterically. One of them jumped up and down on the sidewalk, waving her arms toward her classmates in the school who were looking out of the windows, and screamed over and over again, "Come on out! Come on out!" Tears flowed down her face, her body shook in uncontrollable spasms. 3 of her classmates grew hysterical and threw their arms around each other. They began dancing up and down. "The blank are in," they shrieked. "Come on out of the school. Don't stay there with the blank. Come on out. Come on." Unable to get to us, the crowd began turning on the white journalists covering the scene. Among those attacked were a Life magazine reporter and two of its photographers, whose equipment was yanked and smashed. As that sickening spate of violence unfolded, I was likely stepping into my first class of the day, Mrs. Huckabee's English class, where I was oblivious to the commotion outside. Oblivious again, used again, a vocab word. It means unaware. Remember? Because Mrs. Huckabee was a vice principal, her class was just down the hall from the main office, not far from where I ended up after first entering the school. I just followed her down the hall, and as soon as I walked into her classroom, she directed me to a desk in the front row, 2 seats from the door. She didn't smile readily, and she wasn't particularly warm. I would come to understand that it had nothing to do with me. She treated everyone the same, but I could tell from the outset that she was fair. She didn't tolerate any name-calling, and at the first sight of any snickering or taunts, she shut it down immediately. She also kept her eyes on a small group of boys in the back who were most likely to cause trouble. She wouldn't hesitate to file a disciplinary report, she warned, and since she was an administrator, her threat carried weight. In the weeks and months ahead, her sense of fair play would cause trouble for her among the segregationists, who considered her too sympathetic to us, and thus the enemy. As I slid into my chair in her class that morning, I could feel all my eyes fastened on me. That was one of the things I hated most, being the center of attention. My insides knotted with dread. I wished to be invisible. I stared at my desktop, the worn hardwood floors, Mrs. Huckabee's face, anywhere to avoid the hot gaze of my classmates. Mrs. Huckabee didn't miss a beat, trying to go on with class as though this were a regular day. But there was nothing regular about this. I tried mightily, but I couldn't concentrate. Why wouldn't they stop staring at me? This was not at all how I had imagined feeling on the first day inside my new school. Finally, the bell rang, but momentary relief turned quickly to even more serious dread. Hundreds of students spilled from their classes into the halls. The noise level was louder than the loudest football game I'd ever attended. Every face in the crowd was white, and all they seemed to be staring at me, sneering at me. A group of slick-haired boys with their black leather jackets and white t-shirts with cigarettes rolled in them, poor imitations of James Dean and Elvis Presley, purposely walked too close, bumped me hard with their shoulders, and swaggered off, laughing at that blank. The word was slung at me so often that day that my heart turned almost numb. I tried to tune out their words, their stares, and their finger-pointing, but to no avail. A few students looked my way sympathetically, almost as though they were ashamed of their schoolmates' behavior. But they also seemed afraid to smile, afraid to say hello, afraid to be seen showing even minimal empathy. Their sympathetic eyes quickly looked away as soon as they met mine. I yearned to see a kind face, something or someone familiar. Where were the other black students? I saw no sign of them anywhere. I felt so completely alone. Somehow, I made it to my second and third period classes, and each time was assigned to the first row, a couple of seats from the door. By third period, my nerves were starting to settle a bit. This was geometry, the class I most feared, and I knew I didn't have another moment to waste. My teacher, Margaret Raymond, was a strict disciplinarian who, like Mrs. Huckabee, didn't tolerate any nonsense. Her stern face and voice set the tone. She would put up with no disruptions, she announced firmly. We had much work to do, and she moved quickly into the business of class. The atmosphere was calm for about the first 20 minutes. Then came a knock on the door. I was close enough to see a uniformed officer standing on the other side. Mrs. Raymond walked to the door and snuck her head out. I kept my eyes on the two of them as they talked briefly. As my teacher stepped back into the class, I searched her face for clues. Was something wrong? But her face was blank as she announced, "Carlotta Walls, get your books and follow the gentleman outside." Get my books? My heart sank. I knew I was leaving again for the day. "Follow me," the officer said, turning quickly and stepping speedily down the hall. This time the hallway was empty and quiet, except for the officer's heavy footsteps. As I tried to keep pace with him, my mind turned back to geometry. I couldn't afford to miss another math class. This was my weakest subject. I didn't know anyone yet, so how would I be able to make up the next day's assignment? I'd missed far too much already. The thoughts and questions in my mind made the trek to the office seem short. Once I stepped inside, though, all thoughts about geometry ceased. I could tell right away that something was seriously wrong. My 8 comrades were already gathered there with their books. They looked frightened and confused. Before I could ask any questions, another officer commanded, "This way!" Even with my long legs, I almost had to trot to keep up. I had no idea where we were going or why, but we were in a hurry. It was a labyrinthine descent, around a corner and down some steps several times until we arrived in the mechanics classroom 3 floors below on the grade level. The classroom was an enclosed garage. 2 police cars sat parked inside the garage on a ramp. An officer waiting there instructed us to get in quickly. Then someone handed us several blankets and told us to lie low and hide. "Put your foot to the floor," my driver was told, "and don't stop for anything." Now I was terrified. We were on the run from something, but what? As I lay crouched on the back seat, I lifted my head from under the blanket. I had to see what was going on. If I was going to die, I wanted to see it coming. I heard a loud grinding noise and realized that the garage doors were opening. Streaks of light gradually filled the garage. Then, suddenly, 2 police cars shot out of the garage into the light, and sped down a gravel drive, past the campus inn, the on-site diner where the white students hung out for burgers and cokes at lunch. I prayed no one was crossing the sidewalk there, or they surely would have been killed. As we whizzed down 16th Street, past the stadium, away from the school, I craned my neck but couldn't see anything more than the back of the school. The four of us in the back were too frightened even to speak. The officer sped down streets and whipped around corners until he had dropped the other 3 students in the car with me at their homes. I was the last one to be dropped off. By the time he rounded the corner and pulled to a stop in front of my house, my heart was sprinting. "Thank you," I said politely as I hopped out and headed up the front steps. Mother met me at the door. This time, she didn't even try to hide her fear. Her face was as pale as a sheet of paper, and her eyes were red. I'm certain that her jet black hair started graying that day. She threw her arms around me. "Are you okay?" she asked repeatedly. News of the mob had been on the radio all morning, she said. Wild and erroneous reports about students being beaten and bloodied had even made it to the airwaves. Newscasters were saying the crowd had grown to more than 1,000 people and that police could no longer control them. That's when I realized why we had left in such a hurry. Relatives had been calling all day, and their message was unified. "Get Carlota out of that school." I retreated to my room and took off my new dress. Maybe, I thought, the darn dress brought bad luck. I slipped on my after-school clothes, plopped down on the living room sofa, and stared out of the picture window at the dirt road in front of the house. My eyes fell on my church up the road. I wondered, where was God in all of this? Was it He who had spared us from the wrath of that mob? What if they had gotten inside? Would they really have lynched us? I couldn't understand their fury. All this because they didn't want their children to sit next to me in school? I had heard white parents complain in television interviews that school integration could lead to race mixing and interracial marriage. Was this the source of their rage? If so, it seemed silly to me. I wasn't even old enough to date yet. Would my first day at Central be my last? There was nothing left to do but wait. While I waited for word about what would happen next, I had no idea that at 6:24 p.m., Little Rock Mayor Woodrow Mann was sending a telegram to President Eisenhower, one that ultimately would help to influence the final outcome. The city and state police had tried valiantly to control the mob at Central, Mayor Mann wrote, but the situation ultimately was determined to be too unsafe for 9 of us to remain in school. In the final analysis, it was deemed advisable by the officer on the ground and in charge to have the colored children removed to their homes for safety purposes, he wrote. News reports painted a picture of a city out of control with random mobs roaming the streets, terrorizing any black residents they could find. In black neighborhoods throughout the city, lights were off, curtains were drawn, and streets were still and quiet. The same day, President Eisenhower released a statement. "I want to make several things very clear in connection with the disgraceful occurrence of today at Central High School in the city of Little Rock. They are, number 1, the federal law and orders of the United States District Court implementing that law cannot be flouted without impunity by any individual or any mob of extremists. Number 2, I will use the full power of the United States, including whatever force may be necessary to prevent any obstruction of the law and to carry out the orders of the federal court. Number 3, of course, every right-thinking citizen will hope that the American sense of justice and fair play will prevail in this case. It will be a sad day for this country, both at home and abroad, if school children can safely attend their classes only under the protection of armed guards. Number 4, I repeat my express confidence that the citizens of Little Rock and of Arkansas will respect the law and will not countenance violations of law and order by extremists." President Eisenhower also issued an emergency proclamation barring anyone from blocking the school and interfering with the federal court's desegregation order. But the next morning, I awakened to news reports that the mob had again gathered outside Central, 1,000 people strong. I spent the day indoors, glued to the television. The telephone rang constantly, but I no longer moved to try to answer it. At the first ring, mother or daddy would yell from wherever they were in the house, "I'll get it," and then dash to make it to the phone before my sisters or me. Sometimes they just stood there quietly for a few seconds and hung up without saying a word. But sometimes I could see the anger on Daddy's face as he slammed down the receiver. Neither of them ever said a word to me about those phone calls, but they didn't have to. I knew what was going on. I knew it was those nasty men and women from the street, and I could only imagine that the vile words I spat into the phone. I hated to see the worry that I was causing Mother and Daddy. This was a particularly low day for me. When would it all end? Would we ever get inside and get to meet our classmates at Central without the circus atmosphere? Would they ever get to know us and realize that they had nothing to fear? This time, Mayor Mann sent a more urgent telegram to President Eisenhower. At 9:16 a.m., he wrote, "The immediate need for federal troops is urgent. The mob is much larger in numbers at 8 a.m. than at any time yesterday. People are converging on the scene from all directions. Mob is armed and engaging in fisticuffs and other acts of violence. Situation is out of control." President Eisenhower followed up on his promise that his actions would be quick, hard, and decisive, and signed an executive order to use military force to protect the 9 of us. That night, I watched with my family as the president announced on television that he had called out the troops of the 101st Airborne Division to ensure that the federal school desegregation court order was carried out. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 more pages. Okay. "To make this talk, I have come to the president's office in the White House," he began. "I could have spoken from Rhode Island, where I have been staying recently, but I felt that, in speaking from the house of Lincoln, of Jackson, and of Wilson, my words would better convey both the sadness I feel in the action I was compelled today to take, and the firmness at which I intend to pursue this course until the orders at Little Rock can be executed without unlawful interference." My spirits perked up. More than 1,000 paratroopers were already on their way to Little Rock from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, President Eisenhower said. He also announced that he was placing the Arkansas National Guard under federal orders. The media called the move historic, the first time a U.S. president had called on the military to enforce a federal school desegregation order. But my first thought was, what took so long? The restless teenager I was then. I figured the federal government should have swooped in when Faubus first snubbed the orders of the nation's highest court. I don't feel much differently now, but I am tremendously grateful that President Eisenhower stepped in when he did. I strongly believe it was his military background, the general in him, that gave him the fortitude and forthrightness to stand up to a loudmouth governor who ultimately would go to his grave arguing that his decision to use the National Guard to keep us out of Central was right. But that night, I listened carefully as President Eisenhower got to the heart of why he was using the U.S. military to enforce the law. The very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rest upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of the government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of their federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the President's command. Unless the President did so, anarchy would result. In that moment, I wasn't thinking so much about history or the Constitution or the everlasting impact of the President's words. I rejoiced for the simplest of reasons. Finally, I would be able to return to school, and with the protection of the U.S. military, no less. Later that night, Uncle J.W., a World War II veteran, called to tell me about the 101st Airborne. They were America's military elite, also known as the Screaming Eagles, he explained excitedly. They were renowned for their heroism during the Normandy invasion and the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. Now they were coming to Little Rock. Now I surely would be in good hands, he said. There have been few moments in my life prouder than this one. I believed so strongly, with all the naivety of my youth, that the system of governance I had learned about in school would prevail and that the U.S. Supreme Court order somehow would be upheld. And through it all, I never even considered backing away from my decision to attend Central. I'd been taught all my life not to be a quitter, so quitting just wasn't in my nature. If my parents ever considered pulling me out of Central during those scary first days, they never told me. I'm sure they had tough questions for Mrs. Bates behind closed doors. I'm sure all the parents did. To this day, I don't know exactly what went on in those private meetings between her and them. I just know that in my presence, my parents never wavered in their belief that I had a right to attend Central. And if it took the power and might of the U.S. military to make it happen, well then, so be it. For the first night in a long time, I slept peacefully. I woke up extra early on September 25th. A mix of nervous anticipation and excitement jolted me out of bed before sunrise, even though I wasn't sure I would be going to school. When I went to bed the night before, the word was we were going to wait another day before returning to school, despite the presence of the troops. Mrs. Bates had called my parents around 10 p.m. the night before and told Mother that she had not yet heard from Superintendent Blossom with the plan. Sometime before daybreak, though, Mrs. Bates showed up at our door with different instructions. We were to meet at her house by 8 a.m., she told my parents. Superintendent Blossom had called her after midnight to say that the military troopers would meet the 9 of us at her house later that morning and escort us to school. To make sure we all got the message, Mrs. Bates drove to each of our homes. Blossom had rounded up 2 black men who worked as principals to accompany her. Their first stop at 1 a.m. was the home of Gloria Ray. Gloria's father, on edge from all the threats and mob violence that week, met the unexpected guest at the door with a shotgun, and he was in no mood to hear about his baby going back to Central. "I don't care if the President of the United States gave you those instructions," he barked. "I won't let Gloria go. She's faced 2 mobs and that's enough." Everybody was on edge, Mrs. Bates later wrote, but the remaining parents, including mine, responded a bit calmer. Of course, I wasn't aware of any of this when I first popped out of bed and went to Mother for an update. Yes, I was going to school, she said, revealing, as usual, just what I needed to know, nothing more. I got dressed quickly and grabbed a bite to eat. I couldn't wait to see what this elite military unit looked like. Mother and I pulled up outside the home of Mr. and Mrs. Bates as other students and their parents were getting out of their cars too. The place was already swarming with reporters, photographers, neighbors, and NAACP officials. I joined the other students making small talk until everyone, including Gloria, had arrived. The parents milled about, chatting with one another, while Mr. and Mrs. Bates worked the crowd, reassuring everybody. This was an important day, the couple told us. We would walk into that school under the protection of our U.S. government. The atmosphere was noticeably lighter. One of the ministers in the room led us all in prayer. Heads were bowed and tears rolled down many cheeks as the minister asked God to protect and guide us on this historic day. But I was slightly distracted. Of all things, I couldn't stop thinking about whether I would remember the way to the 3 classes I had attended 2 days earlier. The light chatter returned, but it was soon drowned out by the rumble of military vehicles making their way down the quiet residential street. The army was here, someone announced. A wave of excitement rushed through the room. I dashed to the picture window in the living room as the other students also scattered to get a closer look. A convoy of jeeps rolled past the house and idled in the street. Soldiers dressed in helmets and combat gear hopped out and blocked 28th Street on each end. They stood at attention with their rifles. As a large olive-colored station wagon pulled up in front of the house, Mrs. Bates called us away from the windows. It was time, she said. We gathered our books and made our way to the door. I felt more ready than I'd ever been for this moment. As we stepped outside, the cameras flashed around us from high and low. Reporters shouted questions and jotted into small notebooks. Neighbors stood in their yards and along the streets to bear witness. One by one, the 9 of us climbed into the station wagon. A topless jeep filled with soldiers led the way. Another followed us. This time, we drove at a normal, slow pace. Black mothers and fathers who had been held captive inside their homes for days by the rampaging white mob spilled onto front porches, yards, and the sides of streets. As our convoy moved up 16th Street in the vicinity of the school, I saw small clusters of white parents and children walking away from the school. I learned later that Major General Edwin Walker, commander of the operation, had met with the white students in the auditorium just before we arrived to explain his mission. You have nothing to fear from my soldiers, and no one will interfere with your coming, going, or your peaceful pursuit of your studies, he told them. My soldiers are here because they have been ordered to be here. They are seasoned, well-trained soldiers, many of them combat veterans. Being soldiers, they are as determined as I to carry out their orders. A group of the students walked out. Perhaps they were the stragglers we saw exiting the school grounds as we pulled onto the campus. Their faces looked angry and hateful, but this time there were no loud, hateful words. This time there was no speeding or trying to hide from the mob. The would-be members of the mob had been dispersed, some forcibly, before we arrived. The U.S. military had tucked all 9 of us securely under its wing, and in just a few minutes we would fly right into the heart of Central, almost daring those hateful men and women to try to put their hands on us now. For a few precious moments, life seemed to roll in slow motion as our caravan turned left onto Park Street from 16th. Hundreds of paratroopers lined the streets around the school. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their M1 rifles and bayonets ready. They had been in position since 5 a.m., the news report said, cordoning off the school for 3 blocks on either side. A few students milled around outside, watching the scene quietly, curiously. The streets were graveyard quiet, except for the occasional crackle of the soldiers' walkie-talkies. The soldiers snapped to attention when our station wagon pulled up. This time, we rolled past the side door we had entered on that terrifying first day. Our caravan pulled to a stop right in front of the school. This time, we were going through the front door. Until that moment, it hadn't fully registered that the game of ducking and hiding was over. I could hold my head up. We, had a right to walk through those front doors like anyone else, and the President of the United States had sent our U.S. military to ensure that right. The car door swung open. It was 9:22 a.m. My heart thumped faster than ever before. As I stepped out of the station wagon, the morning sky seemed brighter. The 9 of us got into line, mostly by twos. A helicopter hovered above. Several soldiers trotted across the yard to catch up with us. Then 22 of them positioned themselves completely around us. I felt safe, protected, and proud. In tandem, we began to move slowly, deliberately, off the curb, up the walkway, past the fountain, up the left set of steps, and then up the next set. Finally, I stood at that grand entrance with its heavy wooden doors, surrounded by so much brick and stone. I took a deep breath. The granite eyes of those 4 Greek gods and goddesses above my head seemed to peer down at me. Ambition, personality, opportunity, preparation. Walk with me now, I implored, and with a new sense of calm, I stepped across the threshold. The end of chapter 5. Hope you enjoyed it.